The blood on her cheap linoleum floor was absolutely going to cost her the security deposit. Tess knew that before she even knew his name. She was 6 months pregnant, working double shifts at a diner that smelled perpetually of old grease, and she had just dragged a dying man out of the rain. She thought she was saving a stray. She had no idea she was hiding the city's most dangerous cartel boss, and she definitely didn't expect his ruthless enforcers to look at her and bow. The rain didn't wash away the grime of the city. It just made it slick. Tess leaned against the back door of Frank's diner, pressing her palm against the heavy curve of her stomach. 6 months. Her lower back throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache that timed itself perfectly with the neon sign buzzing overhead. It was 2 a.m. Her shift was over. Her feet felt like bruised meat inside her non-slip shoes. She pulled her thrifted raincoat tighter around her shoulders and stepped into the alley. The shortcut to her apartment complex was a narrow corridor of overflowing dumpsters and rusted fire escapes. It smelled of wet cardboard and rotting vegetables. Tess kept her head down, keys threaded between her knuckles, a habit she'd formed long before the pregnancy made her clumsy and slow. She almost tripped over him. At first, she thought it was a pile of discarded garbage bags. Then the garbage let out a wet, rattling breath. Tess froze, her heart kicking up a frantic tempo. She took a step back, her boots splashing in a puddle that looked unnervingly dark under the flickering amber street lamp. It was a man. He was slumped against the brick wall, a heavy wool overcoat blending into the shadows. One hand was pressed against his side. The other lay limp on the wet asphalt. The dark puddle wasn't just rain. "Keep walking," the survival instinct in her brain whispered. "You have a baby to think about. Keep walking." But he moved. His head rolled to the side, and the streetlight caught the sharp angles of his jaw, the severe line of his nose, and the pale, clammy sheen of his skin. He looked expensive, even covered in filth and bleeding out in an alley. The cut of his coat screamed money. He opened his eyes. They were a cold, piercing grey, fighting against a thick haze of pain. He looked at her, then down at her swollen belly, and let out a harsh, rasping exhale. "Don't," he muttered, the word bubbling with blood. "Cops." Tess swallowed hard. Calling the police meant questions. It meant sitting in a precinct for hours, losing tomorrow's shift, maybe drawing the attention of social services, who were already sniffing around her lack of a stable support system. "I'm not calling the cops," she said, her voice shaking only a little. "But you're dying. Just need a minute." His eyes rolled back. He was going to bleed out right here next to the grease trap. Tess swore, a bitter, exhausted sound that got lost in the rain. She looked around. The alley was empty. Her apartment building's back entrance was less than 50 feet away. "If you die on me, I'm dumping your body in the recycling bin," she warned, stepping closer. She grabbed his uninjured arm, hoisting it over her shoulder. The smell of him hit her instantly. Copper, expensive cedar cologne, and the sharp tang of gunpowder. He was heavy, impossibly heavy. Dead weight wrapped in wet wool. Tess gritted her teeth, her legs shaking under the combined strain of her pregnancy and his bulk. "Up," she grunted. "You have to help me, or we both stay here." Somehow, the command registered. The man dragged his boots against the pavement, finding a fraction of leverage. Together, they stumbled through the rain. Every step was agonizing. By the time she keyed open the rusted security door of her building, Tess was gasping for air, sweat mixing with the rain on her face. She kicked her apartment door shut behind them and let him slide to the floor. He collapsed onto the cheap, peeling linoleum of her kitchen with a heavy thud. Tess didn't waste time panicking. She stripped off her raincoat, tossed it over a chair, and knelt beside him. She pulled back his heavy coat. The white dress shirt underneath was soaked through, sticking to his skin like a macabre second layer. The gunshot wound was high on his left side, just below the ribs. Clean through, from what she could tell, rolling him slightly, but bleeding profusely. She ran to the bathroom, grabbing the limited supplies she had. A bottle of hydrogen peroxide, a roll of gauze she'd stolen from the diner's first aid kit, some heavy-duty tape, and 2 relatively clean towels. When she returned, he was awake again. He watched her with those flat, calculating grey eyes as she knelt beside him. He didn't look like a man who was bleeding out on a stranger's floor. He looked like a man assessing a tactical problem. "This is going to burn," she said, uncapping the peroxide. "Do it." She poured it directly over the wound. The liquid foamed violently, turning pink and white. The man's jaw locked. The muscles in his neck strained like steel cables, but he didn't make a sound. Not a whimper. Not a groan. It was terrifyingly disciplined. Tess pressed the thick towel against the entry and exit wounds, leaning her weight into it. "Hold this," she instructed, grabbing his hand and placing it over the makeshift bandage. She began wrapping the gauze tightly around his torso, taping it down with the heavy-duty adhesive. Her hands were covered in his blood. It was under her fingernails. When she finally sat back on her heels, wiping her forehead with the back of a clean wrist, she found him staring at her, really staring, taking in her worn-out sneakers, her faded maternity jeans, the dark circles under her eyes. "Why?" he asked. His voice was a gravelly whisper. Tess looked at the blood staining her floor, thinking about the deposit she was definitely not getting back. "Because I know what it's like to be left in the dark," she said flatly. "Now shut up and try not to die. I have a morning shift in 5 hours." The alarm went off at 6:30 a.m. It sounded like a chainsaw cutting through sheet metal. Tess groaned, blindly reaching out to slap the snooze button on her phone. Her entire body ached. She felt the heavy, distinct kick of the baby against her ribs, a morning greeting that usually made her smile. Today, it just reminded her of how tired she was. Then she remembered the blood. She sat up instantly, throwing off the thin blanket. The cramped living room of her studio apartment looked the same as always. Water stains on the ceiling, the humming, ancient refrigerator, the radiator that clanked when it tried to push heat, and a dangerous-looking man sleeping on her faded thrift store rug. Tess crept out of bed, her bare feet silent on the floorboards. She approached him cautiously. He had dragged himself from the kitchen linoleum to the slightly softer rug in the center of the room sometime during the night. His breathing was shallow but steady. The makeshift bandages were stained a rusty brown, but the active bleeding seemed to have stopped. In the harsh morning light filtering through the dirty window, he looked less like a corpse and more like trouble. He had the kind of face carved out of granite, sharp, unforgiving, with a faint scar cutting through his left eyebrow. His hands were large, knuckles calloused, with a heavy gold watch hanging loosely on his left wrist. Tess walked over to her tiny kitchenette and started the coffee pot. The gurgling sound was loud in the quiet room. "Black!" Tess jumped, nearly dropping her favorite chipped mug. She spun around. The man was awake. He hadn't moved a muscle, but his eyes were open, tracking her every movement with the terrifying stillness of a predator. "Excuse me," she said, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Coffee, black, if you don't mind." His voice was stronger today. It had a deep, commanding resonance that filled the small space, bouncing off the thin walls. Tess narrowed her eyes. "You bled all over my kitchen. You're currently taking up my entire living room, and you're placing orders. I can pay." "With what?" "Your wallet isn't in your coat. I checked." She crossed her arms, resting them on the shelf of her belly. I figured I should know the name of the guy who might bring a hit squad to my doorstep. He slowly pushed himself up into a sitting position, leaning against her worn armchair. He gritted his teeth, a hiss of pain escaping him, but he managed the movement. "Victor," he said. "My name is Victor." "Tess!" She poured this coffee, adding a generous amount of cheap powdered creamer to hers, and carried the black mug over to him. She set it on the floor beside him, refusing to hand it directly to him. Victor picked it up, taking a sip. He didn't flinch at the bitter, burnt taste of cheap grounds. "You searched my coat." "I was looking for a phone to call an ambulance if you coded," she lied smoothly. She had absolutely been looking for identification. "Who shot you, Victor?" "A disagreement in management," he said smoothly. He looked around the apartment, his gaze lingering on the crack in the window, the single electric heater, the stack of past-due bills on the tiny dining table. Then he looked at her stomach. "You live here alone? That is none of your business." Tess turned her back on him, walking to the closet to pull out her second diner uniform. "I have to go to work. If I don't show up, I get fired. If I get fired, we get evicted." She gestured to her belly. Victor watched her. He had expected panic this morning. Tears, threats to call the police. Instead, this pregnant woman in a faded pink waitress uniform was treating him like an inconvenient plumbing leak. "You're leaving me here?" he asked, genuine surprise breaking through his stoic mask. "You can't walk," she pointed out. "I left some ibuprofen and a glass of water on the counter. Don't bleed on the sofa. Don't answer the door. If you're dead when I get back at 4, I'm rolling you into the hallway and claiming ignorance." She was lacing up her heavy shoes, struggling slightly to bend over her stomach. Victor watched her hands. No wedding ring. "Tess," he said quietly. She paused, looking up. "Thank you." The sincerity in his voice threw her off balance for a second. She masked it quickly, grabbing her purse. "Just don't die. It would really ruin my week." The door clicked shut behind her, the deadbolt sliding into place. Victor sat alone in the silence of the apartment. He waited 10 minutes to ensure she wasn't coming back. Then, grimacing against the tearing pain in his side, he reached down to the heel of his left boot. He pressed a hidden catch, sliding out a small encrypted burner phone. He dialed a number he knew by heart. It rang twice. "Yeah?" A rough voice answered. "It's me," Victor said, a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Boss, Jesus Christ, we thought you were dead. The warehouse was a slaughterhouse." "Where are you?" "Alive," Victor replied, staring at the stack of unpaid bills on the cheap table. "Listen to me closely. I need a secure extraction, but not yet. I have a situation." "Who's got you? Do we need to send the cleaners?" Victor thought of the exhausted woman who had dragged his dead weight through the rain, who had poured acid into his wound without flinching, and who was currently serving eggs to strangers to keep a roof over her unborn child's head. "No," Victor said softly, a dark, unfamiliar warmth settling in his chest. "No one is touching her. Find out who owns a diner in the East End, and get me cash, a lot of it." The smell of Frank's diner was a physical entity. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of burnt coffee, industrial floor cleaner, and decades of vaporized bacon grease that clung to the hair and embedded itself in the skin. Tess wiped down table 4 with a grey rag. Her lower back was a tight coil of agony. Every time she shifted her weight, a sharp pain shot down her sciatic nerve. 8 hours on her feet. 3 more to go. "Hey, sweetheart." The trucker in the booth snapped his fingers. He had a thick neck and a greasy baseball cap. "Coffee's cold. And you forgot my extra hash browns." Tess didn't sigh. Sighing wasted energy. She simply picked up his mug, her face an unreadable mask of professional apathy. "I'll get a fresh pot. Hash browns are coming." "Don't rush on my account," he muttered, eyeing her stomach. "Looks like you shouldn't be rushing anywhere." She walked away without acknowledging the jab. In the kitchen, the grill cook, a skinny kid named Toby, slid a plate of scorched potatoes onto the pass. "Stan's looking for you," Toby warned, not looking up from the sizzling burgers. "He's in a mood about the napkin dispensers." Tess grabbed the plate. Stan was the manager, a man who treated his mediocre diner like a Michelin star restaurant and paid his staff in pennies and insults. He cornered her near the wait station. "You're moving like molasses today, Tess," Stan said, crossing his arms. He pointed a stubby finger at her. "I know you're pregnant, but this is a business. If you can't keep up the pace, I can find a teenager who will work for half your tips." "I'm keeping up," Tess said flatly, pouring the coffee. "Table 4 is handled. The condiments are restocked. I'm taking my 10-minute break at 3 o'clock. She walked past him before he could argue. Survival in this tax bracket wasn't about fighting back. It was about outlasting them. You put your head down, you took the hits, and you counted the cash at the end of the night. By the time she finally clocked out, the sky was a bruised purple, threatening more rain. She walked the 6 blocks to her apartment, the plastic bag of leftover dinner rolls swinging against her thigh. Her mind drifted back to the man on her floor. Victor. She fully expected him to be dead. The thought didn't bring panic, just a heavy, cynical dread. A dead body meant calling the coroner. It meant the police. It meant an eviction notice taped to her door by Friday. She keyed the lock, bracing herself for the smell of copper and decay. She pushed the door open. The apartment smelled like lemon bleach and roasted chicken. Tess stopped in the doorway. The bloodstain on the linoleum was completely gone. The floor was cleaner than it had been when she moved in. And Victor was sitting at her tiny, wobbly dining table, wearing a clean black Henley shirt and dark slacks. He looked entirely out of place in her crumbling apartment, like a wolf sitting in a cardboard box. "You're alive," she said, dropping her keys in the ceramic bowl by the door. "I told you I'd try," Victor replied. His voice was still rough, but the hollow rattle of death was gone. Tess stepped further inside, her eyes scanning the room. On the counter, next to her ancient microwave, sat 3 brown paper grocery bags. Next to the bags was a thick, banded stack of $100 bills. It looked like more money than she would make in 2 years. "What is this?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "Dinner," Victor said. "And compensation for your floor. And the medical supplies." My associates dropped a bag through the fire escape window. Tess walked over to the table and picked up the stack of cash. It was heavy. It felt dirty. She walked over to Victor and dropped the money squarely onto his lap. "I don't want it." Victor looked at the money, then up at her. Genuine confusion flickered in his cold grey eyes. "It's $50,000. It solves your problems. It creates new ones," Tess snapped, dropping her heavy work shoes by the door and rubbing her swollen ankles. "Money like that comes with strings. It comes with questions. I drag you out of an alley, I patch you up, and suddenly I'm on the payroll? No. You needed help. I helped you. We are even." Victor watched her. He was accustomed to greed. He lived in a world built on transactions, where every favor had a price tag and every loyalty was bought. The woman standing in front of him, exhausted, underpaid and heavily pregnant, was refusing a lifeline out of pure, stubborn pride. "Who is the father?" he asked quietly. Tess stiffened. She walked over to the kitchenette and began putting the expensive groceries away. Fresher produce, high-end meats, artisan bread. "He's nobody," she said, shoving a carton of organic eggs into the fridge. "He was a mechanic. We dated for a year. I told him I was pregnant. He said he was going out for cigarettes, and he blocked my number. It's a cliché. Don't act surprised." "I'm not surprised," Victor said. "I am just observing." "Well, stop observing and start planning your exit. You got your people to bring you clothes and chicken. They can come carry you out of here." "They are coming tonight," Victor said. Tess paused, a box of pasta in her hand. She turned to look at him. "Your mob friends are coming here? To my apartment?" "They are my employees," Victor corrected. "And yes, it is no longer safe for me to remain stationary. They will arrive at midnight to extract me." He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. The movement clearly pained him, but his expression remained stoic. "You have nothing to fear from them, Tess. You have my word." Tess scoffed, a bitter, humorless sound. "Your word. The word of a guy who got shot in a management dispute. Fantastic. I'll just put on a pot of coffee for the hit squad." Midnight arrived with a heavy, oppressive silence. The rain had started again, drumming against the thin glass of the single window. Tess sat in her armchair, a heavy iron skillet resting casually on her lap. She knew it was a ridiculous weapon against men who likely carried automatic firearms, but the solid weight of the cast iron grounded her. Victor sat opposite her on the sofa, still as a statue, watching the door. At 12:03 a.m., the knock came. It wasn't a frantic pounding. It was 3 sharp, measured raps, precise, deliberate. Victor nodded at her. "Open it." Tess stood up, her joints popping in protest. She kept the skillet gripped tightly in her right hand as she walked to the door. She unlocked the deadbolt and turned the knob, pulling the door open just a few inches. 3 men stood in the dimly lit hallway. They wore dark, tailored suits that looked absurd against the peeling paint of the corridor. The man in the front was built like a heavyweight boxer, with a thick neck, a broken nose, and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He looked down at Tess, taking in her pregnant belly and the skillet in her hand. He didn't smile. "We're here for him." "Let them in, Tess," Victor commanded from the sofa. She stepped back, pulling the door wide. The 3 men filed into the cramped apartment. Instantly, the space felt microscopic. They commanded the room, bringing with them an aura of absolute violence and disciplined restraint. The boxer stepped forward, his eyes locking onto Victor. The relief on the big man's face was instantaneous, stripping away his hardened exterior for a fraction of a second. He dropped to one knee on the thrift store rug, bowing his head. "Boss," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We tore the South Side apart looking for you. The Italians denied it, but we hit their ports anyway." "Get up, Carmine," Victor said softly. "The Italians didn't do this. It was an internal play. I'll give you the names when we're secure." Carmine stood, his massive frame radiating lethal intent. "They're dead men." The other 2 men stepped forward, murmuring their respects. They kept their voices low, but the reverence was undeniable. These were killers, men who extracted debts with hammers and guns, and they were treating the man on her cheap sofa like a deity. Tess stood by the door, feeling completely out of her depth. She tightened her grip on the skillet, wishing she had just kept walking past that alley. Victor slowly got to his feet. Carmine immediately reached out to support him, but Victor waved him off with a sharp gesture. He stood tall, despite the bandage pulling at his ribs. He turned his gaze to Tess. "Carmine," Victor said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Look at her." Carmine turned. The other 2 men turned, 6 eyes locked onto Tess. She swallowed hard, lifting her chin, refusing to shrink back against the wall. "This is Tess," Victor stated. The room went completely still. I bled out in an alley. I was dead. She picked me up. She carried me. She hid me here, and she put herself at immense risk to ensure I breathed another day. Without her, this family falls into chaos. Without her, you are attending my funeral." Carmine stared at her. The cold, assessing look in his eyes vanished. It was replaced by a look of profound, staggering realization. Victor took a step toward her. "Tess refused my money. She refused to be bought. She acted out of a fundamental decency that our world beat out of us a long time ago." Victor looked back at his men. "From this moment forward, her life is worth more than yours. Her child is untouchable. If she calls, you answer. If she needs a wall torn down, you bring the sledgehammers. Do you understand me?" Carmine didn't hesitate. The massive enforcer took 2 steps toward Tess. She tensed, but he didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he bowed. It wasn't a polite nod. It was a deep, formal lowering of his head, exposing his neck to her. "You saved the king," Carmine said, his rough voice completely sincere. "Our lives are yours, Donna." The other 2 men mirrored the movement, bowing in perfect synchronization. "Donna," they echoed. Tess stared at them, entirely speechless. The skillet felt heavy and ridiculous in her hand. Donna, queen. They were looking at a broke, exhausted, pregnant waitress in a dingy apartment, and they were treating her like royalty. Victor walked past his men, stopping inches from Tess. He looked down into her eyes, his grey gaze intense and unwavering. "I have to go," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "I have a war to finish, but I will be back. I leave nothing behind, Tess, especially not the woman who saved my life." He reached out, his calloused fingers gently brushing against the side of her face. The touch was startlingly tender, a stark contrast to the violence he commanded. Then he turned and walked out the door. His men followed, but not before Carmine paused, looking at Tess one last time. "Keep the doors locked, Donna," he said respectfully. "We have eyes on the building. You sleep safe tonight." The door clicked shut. The deadbolt engaged. Tess stood alone in her apartment. The heavy scent of expensive cologne lingered in the air, mixing with the smell of old linoleum. She looked down at her stomach, placing a hand over the baby. "Well, kid," she whispered into the silence. "Looks like we just joined the mob." The stack of $100 bills was still sitting on her wobbly kitchen table when the sun came up. Tess stared at it while she brushed her teeth. $50,000. It was a down payment on a house in the suburbs. It was a college fund. It was an escape hatch from the crushing, endless cycle of minimum wage and past due notices. It was also blood money. Victor had left it behind, a silent testament to a debt he believed he owed. She spat into the rusted sink, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, and grabbed an empty oatmeal canister from the pantry. She shoved the banded stacks inside, put the lid back on, and pushed it to the very back of the top shelf. Out of sight, out of mind. She was a waitress, not a mob wife. The walk to Frank's diner felt different that morning. Tess couldn't pinpoint exactly what had changed, but the air felt heavier. She noticed a black sedan parked across the street from her building. Its windows were tinted pitch black. When she turned the corner onto Elm Street, a man in a grey utility jacket paused his street sweeping to watch her pass. He didn't look at her with the usual predatory creepiness of the city. He looked at her the way a Secret Service agent watches a dignitary. Carmine had said they had eyes on the building. He hadn't been exaggerating. The diner was a madhouse. The Tuesday morning rush brought in construction workers, hungover college students, and bitter retirees who wanted their eggs poached to microscopic specifications. Tess tied her stained apron over her waist, instantly feeling the familiar ache settle into her lower spine. The baby kicked, a sharp jab against her bladder. Table 3 needs clearing, and Table 7 has been waiting 10 minutes for water, Stan barked as she walked past the register. He was sweating, his comb-over plastered to his forehead. "Move it, Tess. We aren't paying you to waddle." Tess bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper. She grabbed a bus tub and headed for Table 3. By noon, the lunch rush had peaked. Every booth was full, except for one. The corner booth in the back, the one with the cracked red vinyl, was occupied by 2 men who hadn't touched the menus. They wore dark, tailored suits. They sat in absolute silence, nursing black coffees. Tess recognized one of them from the night before. He was the younger one who had flanked Carmine, the one with the jagged scar tracing his jawline. She walked over, pulling her notepad from her apron. "Can I get you guys anything to eat? The meatloaf is decent today." The scarred man looked up. His expression immediately softened into something that looked dangerously like reverence. "No, thank you, Donna," he said quietly. "We are just here to make sure you have a quiet shift." Tess felt a flush of embarrassment heat her cheeks. She leaned in closer, dropping her voice. "You can't call me that, and you can't just sit here taking up a paying table. Stan will lose his mind." "Stan will mind his own business," the second man stated flatly. He didn't even look up from his coffee. As if summoned by his name, the manager stormed out of the kitchen. His face was a mottled, angry purple. He marched straight toward the corner booth, pointing a grease-stained finger. "Hey, you've been sitting here for 2 hours on 2 cups of coffee," Stan yelled, his voice cutting through the clatter of silverware and diner chatter. "You buy lunch or you get out. This isn't a library." Tess squeezed her eyes shut. "Idiot." The scarred man slowly placed his ceramic mug on the table. He didn't stand up. He didn't raise his voice. He simply turned his head and looked at Stan. "We are enjoying the coffee," the man said. The temperature in the diner seemed to drop 10 degrees. "I don't care what you're enjoying," Stan snapped, though his voice wavered slightly. He puffed out his chest, trying to maintain authority in his own domain. "Get out. And Tess, stop fraternizing and get back to work. I'm docking your pay for this 10 minutes." The second man stood up. He wasn't exceptionally tall, but the way he moved, fluid, balanced, entirely devoid of hesitation, made Stan take a physical step backward. The man reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. Stan flinched. Instead of a weapon, the man pulled out a thick money clip. He peeled off 5 $100 bills and dropped them onto the sticky table. "This covers the coffee," the man said smoothly. "And the table. We will sit here until she clocks out." He stepped closer to Stan, lowering his voice to a chilling whisper that only Tess and the manager could hear. "If you ever speak to her in that tone again, if you ever threaten her wages again, they will find you in the grease trap out back. Nod if you comprehend the mathematics of this transaction." Stan turned a sickly shade of grey. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He nodded, a jerky, terrified motion. "Excellent," the man said, sitting back down and smoothing his tie. "Now fetch the lady a stool. She's been standing all morning." Stan practically ran to the counter, dragging a heavy wooden stool over to the wait station. He didn't look at Tess. He didn't look at the suits. He just retreated to the kitchen, entirely broken. Tess stood there, holding her empty order pad. She looked at the 2 mobsters. They were already back to staring blankly at the wall, ignoring the terrified whispers of the other patrons. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. For 6 months, she had been entirely alone. She had fought for every dime, swallowed every insult, and braced herself against a world that didn't care if she fell apart. Now, 2 terrifying men were buying her the right to sit down. She walked over to the wait station and sat on the stool. The relief in her feet was instantaneous. She rested her hands on her stomach, feeling a slow, heavy realization settle over her. Victor wasn't just a stray she had dragged out of the rain. He was a tidal wave, and she was already caught in the current. The false sense of security lasted exactly 48 hours. By Thursday night, the rain had returned, turning the city streets into a slick, reflecting mirror of neon and brake lights. Tess finished her closing shift at midnight. The diner was empty, smelling of industrial bleach and exhaustion. She walked out the back door into the alley. The two suits who usually shadowed her were nowhere to be seen. Tess frowned, pulling her raincoat tighter around her stomach. Usually the black sedan was idling at the curb. Tonight, the street was entirely deserted. The silence was absolute, thick enough to choke on. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. The city was never this quiet. She gripped her keys, threading them between her fingers. Walk fast. Don't look back. She made it halfway down the alley toward her apartment complex when the shadows detached themselves from the brick walls. There were 4 of them. They didn't wear tailored suits like Victor's men. They wore dark leather, combat boots, and the kind of cheap, disposable masks that screamed absolute anonymity. One of them racked the slide of a pistol. The metallic clack echoed loudly in the narrow space. "Don't scream," the leader said. His voice was muffled, but the threat was crystal clear. "You make a sound, I shoot you in the stomach. We clear?" Tess froze. Her breath hitched in her throat. Her hands instinctively went to her belly, shielding the baby with her arms. The survival instinct that had kept her alive this long screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like lead. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to keep it steady. "I don't have any money." "We don't want your tips, sweetheart," the man chuckled, stepping closer. The smell of cheap beer and stale cigarette smoke rolled off him. "We want to know where Victor is. We know he bled out around here. We know someone patched him up. Word on the street is his boys have been playing bodyguard for a pregnant waitress. That makes you leverage." Tess backed up until her shoulders hit the cold, wet brick of the alley wall. Victor's internal play. This was the other side of the war. "I don't know where he is," Tess said, swallowing the panic rising in her throat. "He left days ago. I haven't seen him." "Liar!" Another man spat, lunging forward and grabbing her by the collar of her raincoat. He slammed her back against the brick. Pain exploded in Tess's shoulder, but the pure, animalistic terror for her child overshadowed it. She swung her fist blindly, the keys slicing across the man's cheek. He shouted, stumbling back and pressing a hand to his bleeding face. "You stupid bitch!" The leader raised his pistol, aiming it directly at her chest. Tess squeezed her eyes shut. She braced for the end. The gunshot was deafening, but the bullet didn't hit her. Tess opened her eyes. The leader was on the ground, a dark pool spreading rapidly out from beneath his head. The man who had grabbed her stared at the body in paralyzed shock. A shadow dropped from the fire escape above them, landing with a heavy, terrifying grace. It was Victor. He didn't look like the dying man she had dragged through this very alley. He looked like the devil himself. He wore a dark trench coat that flared around his legs, and his face was a mask of cold, unadulterated fury. In his right hand, he held a suppressed handgun. Before the remaining 3 men could even raise their weapons, Victor moved. It was a masterclass in calculated violence. He stepped into the space of the man Tess had cut, snapping his arm backward with a sickening crack before putting a bullet through his knee. The man collapsed, screaming. The 3rd man fired wildly. The bullet sparked against the brick wall, inches from Tess's head. Victor didn't even flinch. He pivoted, firing twice. The 3rd man dropped instantly. The 4th man threw his gun down and ran toward the street. From the shadows near the dumpsters, Carmine stepped out. He caught the fleeing man by the throat, lifting him an inch off the ground. Carmine didn't use a gun. He simply squeezed. The man kicked frantically for 10 seconds before going completely limp. Carmine dropped him like a sack of garbage. The alley was dead silent again, save for the wet, gasping sobs of the man bleeding out on the asphalt. Victor walked over to him. He didn't say a word. He just raised his gun and ended the noise. Tess stood frozen against the wall. Her knees gave out. She slid down the wet brick, landing heavily on the asphalt, her hand still wrapped protectively around her stomach. She was hyperventilating, the adrenaline crashing through her system like a poison. Victor holstered his weapon. He walked over to her, his movements slow now, careful. He knelt in the puddles of rain and blood, perfectly ruining his expensive trousers. "Tess," he said softly. The violence was entirely gone from his voice. She looked up at him. She expected to see a monster. She expected to see the cold, dead eyes of a killer. Instead, she saw a man who looked terrified. He reached out, his hands hovering over her arms, afraid to touch her. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice tight. "Did they hurt the baby?" "No," Tess choked out. A tear cut through the rain on her cheek. "I'm okay." Victor let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a century. He finally closed the distance, wrapping his arms around her and pulling her into his chest. He smelled like gunpowder and cedar. It was the scent of the man she had saved, and the scent of the man who had just butchered 4 people in front of her. "I'm sorry," Victor whispered fiercely against her hair. "They slipped past my perimeter. It will never happen again." He pulled back, looking into her eyes. The authority was back, heavy and undeniable. "You can't stay here," he said. It wasn't a suggestion. "Your apartment is compromised. The diner is compromised. I am taking you home." Tess looked at the bodies littering the alley. She looked at Carmine, who was quietly dragging them behind the dumpsters. She looked back at Victor. The life she knew was over. The cheap apartment, the terrible shifts, the crushing loneliness. It was all gone, erased by bullets and blood. She nodded slowly. "Okay." Victor stood up and effortlessly lifted her into his arms. He carried her out of the alley, stepping over the violence he had created, taking his queen out of the gutter and into his kingdom. The ride to Victor's estate was a blur of adrenaline and exhaustion. Tess sat in the back of the armored SUV, wrapped in Victor's heavy trench coat. The leather seats smelled like expensive detailing spray and old leather. It was a stark contrast to the scent of copper and wet garbage she had just left behind. Victor sat beside her. He didn't speak. He didn't try to offer hollow comfort. He simply kept his hand resting on the seat between them, a silent, physical anchor in a world that had just spun violently off its axis. They drove out of the city, leaving the flickering neon of the East End for the winding, unlit roads of the northern hills. The gates to the property appeared out of the darkness like a military checkpoint. Wrought iron, thick stone pillars, and men carrying rifles who nodded once as the SUV rolled past. The house itself wasn't a fairy tale castle. It was a fortress of concrete, steel, and massive panes of bulletproof glass built into the side of a cliff. "We are secure," Victor said, as the engine cut out in a subterranean garage. Carmine opened the door. Tess climbed out, her legs trembling so badly she nearly buckled. The reality of the night was finally catching up to her. 4 dead men in an alley, her life packed into whatever she had in her pockets. Victor was at her side instantly, his hand gripping her elbow. He didn't carry her this time. He guided her, sensing she needed to walk on her own 2 feet to feel human. They took a private elevator up to the main floor. The doors parted to reveal a space that belonged in an architectural digest, but felt entirely devoid of warmth. slate floors, minimalist furniture, and art that looked angry and expensive. A man in a wrinkled dress shirt and a loosened tie was waiting for them in the kitchen. He had a medical bag open on the massive marble island. "Dr. Hayes," Victor said, his voice flat. "Check her." Tess blinked, pulling the trench coat tighter around herself. "I'm fine, I'm just tired." "You were assaulted," Victor corrected, his eyes locking onto hers. "You were shoved against a brick wall. The adrenaline is masking the pain." "Let him check you, Tess. For the baby." That broke her resistance. She nodded slowly, allowing the doctor to guide her to a plush, oversized sofa in the adjacent living room. Victor didn't leave. He stood in the corner of the room, his arms crossed, watching the doctor with the intensity of a sniper. Dr. Hayes was professional and fast. He checked her pupils, palpated her bruised shoulder where she had hit the brick, and took her blood pressure. "Elevated, but expected given the circumstances," he muttered, pulling a portable Doppler ultrasound from his bag. He squirted a dollop of cold gel onto her stomach. Tess hissed through her teeth at the temperature. The doctor moved the wand around the swell of her belly. For 3 agonizing seconds there was only static. Tess felt her breath trap itself in her lungs. She looked at Victor. The Mafia Boss had gone completely rigid, his knuckles white where he gripped his own biceps. Then the sound filled the room. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. Rapid, steady, strong. The fetal heartbeat echoed off the concrete walls of the fortress, the only pure, untainted thing in the entire building. Tess let out a jagged sob, her hands covering her face as the relief washed over her in a tidal wave. In the corner, Victor exhaled, the tension drained out of his shoulders. A man who spent his life ordering deaths, orchestrating violence, and building an empire on blood, stood entirely captivated by the sound of a 6-month-old unborn child clinging to life. When the doctor packed up and left, leaving a bottle of prenatal vitamins and instructions to rest, the silence in the house became deafening. Victor walked over and sat on the coffee table opposite the sofa. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The harsh overhead lighting caught the grey in his eyes, and the exhaustion carving lines into his face. "I brought this to your door," he said quietly. "I swore I wouldn't, and I failed." Tess sat up, wiping her face with the sleeve of the oversized coat. She looked around the cavernous, cold room. "Who were they, Victor?" "Men loyal to a capo named Dominic," Victor replied without hesitation. "He was the one who orchestrated the hit on me last week. He thought I was dead. When whispers started circulating that I survived and was recuperating in the East End, he sent a crew to find out who was hiding me. So, what happens now?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Do I just live in this concrete bunker forever? Do I raise my kid in a mafia safe house?" "No," Victor said sharply. "Dominic is a dead man walking. My men are tearing his operation apart as we speak. This war ends in 48 hours. Until then, you remain here. You are the only leverage he could possibly use against me." Tess stared at him. "I'm not your weakness, Victor. I'm just the girl who didn't let you bleed out in the garbage." "You are the woman who saved my life," he countered, his voice dropping low, vibrating with an intensity that made the hair on her arms stand up. "You are the woman my men call Queen. In my world, that makes you the most valuable asset I have, and I protect what is mine." Tess swallowed hard. The cynicism that had armored her for years felt entirely useless against the raw, absolute truth in his eyes. She wasn't just a stray he was feeding anymore. She was part of the foundation. By the 3rd day, the golden cage began to rust. Tess was losing her mind. She had slept for 14 hours straight the first night. The second day, she had eaten food prepared by a private chef that tasted better than anything she had ever put in her mouth. But by the third morning, the silence of the estate was clawing at her sanity. She was a woman used to motion. Surviving on minimum wage meant you never stopped moving. Sitting in a leather chair overlooking a private forest felt like waiting for an execution. She walked out of her guest suite wearing a pair of soft grey sweatpants and a cashmere sweater that someone had discreetly left in her closet. The fabric cost more than her annual rent. She hated how comfortable it felt. She padded down the wide, silent hallway toward the front of the house. Carmine was stationed by the elevator, a permanent fixture of granite and muscle. He straightened as she approached, offering that same deep, respectful nod. "Morning, Donna." "Carmine, if you don't stop calling me that, I'm going to throw a very expensive vase at your head," she warned, though there was no real bite in her tone. He offered a ghost of a smile. "Noted. You need something to eat?" "I need to hear a human voice that isn't asking if my pillows are fluffed," she said, leaning against the wall and rubbing her lower back. "Where is he?" Carmine hesitated, his eyes shifting toward a set of heavy mahogany doors at the end of the hall. "The boss is in the war room. It's a closed meeting. The lieutenants are here. Things are tense." Tess looked at the doors. The muffled sound of shouting bled through the thick wood. She recognized the cadence of an argument. It sounded exactly like the kitchen staff at Frank's diner, fighting over stolen tips, just dressed up in custom suits. Before Carmine could stop her, Tess pushed off the wall and walked toward the doors. "Tess, wait! You can't—" Carmine started, taking a step forward. She didn't stop. She grabbed the brass handles and pushed the heavy doors open. The room was vast, dominated by a massive oak conference table. 10 men in various states of agitation were gathered around it. Blue cigar smoke hung heavy in the air. Maps and ledgers were scattered across the wood. Victor stood at the head of the table, his hands planted on the surface, his face a mask of restrained violence. The shouting stopped the instant the doors clicked open. 10 pairs of eyes snapped to the pregnant woman standing in the doorway. Most of them recognized her from the whispers. A few looked confused. One, a man with slicked back hair and a sharp, cruel face, looked openly disgusted. "Get out!" the sharp-faced man snapped. "This isn't a daycare." Victor moved so fast it was terrifying. In a fraction of a second, he rounded the table, grabbed the man by the lapels of his jacket, and slammed him back against the wood paneling of the wall. The sound was like a gunshot. "Speak to her like that again, Leo," Victor whispered, his voice dead and hollow, "and I will cut out your tongue and feed it to the dogs." The room froze. Nobody breathed. Tess didn't cower. She had dealt with drunken line cooks pulling knives over burnt steaks. She walked into the room, leaving the doors open behind her. She walked straight to the table, looking down at the scattered ledgers. "I'm sorry to interrupt the testosterone festival," Tess said, her voice cutting through the thick tension like a serrated blade. She looked at Victor, who slowly released Leo. Victor's eyes were blazing, but he stepped back, giving her the floor. Tess looked at the sharp-faced man rubbing his chest, then at the others. "You're trying to figure out where Dominic is hiding his cash flow, right?" she asked, pointing to a column of numbers on a shipping manifest. A heavy-set man across the table blinked. "Excuse me? I was standing outside the door for 2 minutes. You're yelling about missing shipments from the docks," Tess said, rolling her eyes. She tapped a manicured fingernail against a specific date on the ledger. "When Stan, my old manager, wanted to skim from the register, he didn't fake the big bills. He faked the voided receipts on small items, coffee, side salads. You're looking for shipping crates. Dominic isn't hiding his money in the crates. He's hiding it in the pallets." The room went dead silent again. Victor looked at the ledger. He traced the line she had pointed out, his brow furrowing. He looked up at Carmine, who had stepped into the room behind Tess. "Pull the pallet manifests from Pier 4 for the last 3 months," Victor ordered. Carmine nodded and pulled out his phone. Leo sneered, adjusting his jacket. "We're taking strategic advice from a waitress now?" Tess turned to look at Leo. She didn't raise her voice. She channeled every ounce of exhaustion, every ounce of surviving a city that tried to break her daily into a single, flat stare. "I managed inventory for a business that ran on a razor-thin margin while dealing with people twice as smart as you," Tess said coldly. "And I did it on my feet for 8 hours a day, carrying an extra 20 pounds. So yeah, Leo, you're taking advice from a waitress, because while you boys were busy waving your guns around, measuring who has the biggest ego, I just found the money." Victor let out a sound that was half a cough and half a laugh. The dark, heavy anger that had possessed him a moment ago evaporated. He looked at Tess, his grey eyes shining with an absolute, terrifying devotion. "Meeting adjourned," Victor announced, his gaze never leaving Tess. "Check the pallets. Find Dominic. We end this tonight." The men scrambled to pack up their papers. They filed out of the room quickly, avoiding Tess's gaze. Even Leo kept his mouth shut, hurrying past Carmine. When the doors finally clicked shut, leaving them alone, Victor walked over to her. He stopped inches away, looking down at the ledger and then back up at her face. "You are entirely reckless," he said softly. "You were going to kill him over an insult," Tess fired back, refusing to back down. "That's bad for morale. You can't lead an army if you're executing your own officers over a waitress." Victor reached out, his knuckles grazing the soft cashmere on her shoulder. "You are not just a waitress, Tess. You just proved that to every man in this room. They won't just respect you because I demand it anymore. They'll respect you because they fear you." Tess looked at his hand, then up into his eyes. "I don't want to be feared, Victor. I just want to survive." "You will do more than survive," Victor promised, stepping closer, the scent of his cedar cologne wrapping around her. "You are going to rule." The rain finally stopped around 3:15 a.m., leaving the world slick and terrifyingly silent. Tess stood by the floor-to-ceiling window in the main living area, a ceramic mug of lukewarm decaf clutched tightly in her hands. The thick, bulletproof glass was cold against her forehead. Below the estate, the private forest was an ink-black void, giving way to the distant, flickering grid of city lights. She couldn't sleep. Somewhere out in that darkness, Victor was dismantling a criminal empire because a rival capo had made the fatal mistake of putting a gun to her chest. The rational part of her brain, the part that counted pennies and trusted absolutely no one to pay her rent, screamed that this was temporary. Men like Victor didn't build stable families, they built body counts. But the cold, hard logic she had relied on for survival was rapidly failing her. She pressed a hand to her swollen stomach. The baby shifted, a slow, rolling pressure that grounded her. She cared if Victor came back. She was no longer just a bystander. She was invested. At 4:15 a.m., a pair of headlights pierced the heavy tree line. Then another. A convoy of 4 armored SUVs wound its way up the private road. They didn't move with frantic urgency. They moved slow, deliberate, victorious. Tess set her mug down on the glass table. Her hand shook. Her heart hammered a suffocating rhythm, but she forced herself to stand completely still. She wouldn't run to the door. She was learning how to hold her ground. The private elevator hummed inside the walls. The steel doors slid open. Carmine stepped out first. His tailored jacket was gone, his white shirt torn violently at the shoulder to reveal a crude, blood-soaked field bandage. He looked physically hollowed out, but the anxious set of his jaw from earlier had been replaced by a savage, settled calm. He saw Tess, stopped, and bowed his head deeply. "Pier 4 is ours, Donna," Carmine rasped, his voice rough from shouting over gunfire. "Dominic is no longer a problem. The shipments are secured, and the Port Authority is turning a blind eye. Your math was perfect." Tess swallowed hard, her throat painfully dry. "And Victor?" Carmine stepped aside. Victor walked out of the elevator. He was a mess. His custom charcoal suit was ruined, covered in concrete dust and drying blood. He walked with a heavy limp, favoring his left side. His face was smudged with ash, emphasizing the brutal angles of his jaw and the cold silver of his eyes. He looked exactly like what he was, a warlord returning from a slaughter. Untouchable. Lethal. Then he saw her. The warlord vanished. He dropped the heavy tactical shotgun he was holding. It clattered loudly against the slate floor, echoing sharply through the quiet house. "Leave us, Carmine," Victor commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. Carmine nodded. "The perimeter is locked, boss." He offered Tess one last respectful nod, then keyed the elevator and disappeared. Victor didn't speak. He crossed the room in long, uneven strides. He stopped a foot away, his breathing heavy and jagged. He raised his hands, hesitated, and looked down at his own blood-stained knuckles. He was suddenly painfully aware of his own violence, afraid to tarnish her with it. Tess didn't hesitate. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms tightly around his waist. Victor let out a shattered exhale, burying his face in the crook of her neck. His arms came around her, gentle and careful, shielding her belly while holding her tight enough to prove he was still breathing. He smelled like sulfur, wet asphalt, and exhaustion. It was the most comforting thing she had ever felt. "I've got you," she whispered, gripping his ruined shirt. "It's done," Victor murmured against her skin. "I burned his operation to the bedrock. You gave us the angle. We hit them before they even knew we were out of the city." "I just did the math," Tess said, a weak, genuine smile pulling at her mouth. "You won the war," Victor corrected softly. He moved his hand down, resting his broad palm flush against the curve of her stomach. The baby delivered a sharp, distinct kick right against his hand. Victor froze, entirely captivated by the flutter of movement beneath her sweater. He looked up at Tess, a silent, reverent awe replacing the violence in his gaze. "He's been active all night," Tess said softly. "I think he was waiting for you." "He," Victor repeated, accepting it as absolute truth. "He will never know an alleyway. He will never know an empty fridge. He will have this entire city. And so will you." Outside, a pale, bruised purple dawn crept over the horizon. The city below was waking up, unaware its underworld had just been violently reorganized by a pregnant waitress. Tess looked around the quiet room. It wasn't the life she had planned, but for the first time, she wasn't facing it alone. She had a shield built of money, muscle, and a man who would burn the world to ash to keep her warm. "I don't need a city, Victor," Tess said, covering his hand on her stomach. "I just need you to come back, through that door." Victor pressed a fierce, lingering kiss to her forehead. "I will always come back. That is a vow, Tess. You are my queen. This is your house now." Tess closed her eyes, safely anchored in his arms. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's rule." And that is how a broke, exhausted waitress went from hiding a bleeding stranger on her kitchen floor to ruling the city's most dangerous cartel. Tess thought she was just trying to survive another shift, but she ended up building an empire and finding a family in the darkest of places. If you loved this story of loyalty, survival, and unexpected romance, don't let it stop here. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with your friends who love a gritty, grounded mafia drama. Let us know your favorite moment in the comments below. We will see you in the next video.